it didn't pop up on my, it's recording now.
I just realised I was on mute the whole time as well, but no, it is recording now.
That's
perfect. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Double check. Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and for Kelly for inviting me to talk to you. As you mentioned, today I'm going to talk around perceptions and experiences of the menstrual cycle in elite sport. So I'm a researcher based at Swansea University. I'm working with Sport Wales and the Welsh Institute of Performance Sciences. Kelly's already kindly introduced. I suppose really to give a quick background before I come into specifically how I got into this area, that previously I worked at Sport Wales as a physiologist and also as a performance scientist with Welsh and British swimming. I then went on to do my PhD, which actually was focused around preparation and recovery in elite athletes. So very much my background was within elite sport. My PhD had more of a hormone focus around preparation and recovery. And I kind of came then into this post. And when I started this post, I was given the research topic of, can you go away and research female athletes? And I was just like, that is the broadest, biggest area that you could ask. And I suppose I went through a process really working directly with sports at Sport Wales to kind of identify different factors specific to female athletes that might affect their performance, and linked to, I suppose, with my hormone kind of more background and interest, started off with the menstrual cycle. And actually we started off with this a very, very broad topic, I suppose, or area, which was how can we support females to perform at their best on any day of their menstrual cycle? And really that was the starting point and like the overarching aim. But one of the things for me with that was actually, what about the person? So based at Sport Wales, it is a very kind of person-centered approach, working with athletes, and literature kind of, we're all aware, and Kelly's done an amazing job pulling together a systematic review of literature to say, actually, does it affect performance, yes or no? But actually one of the things for me was, how does it affect the person? And the research in performance, as I said, is varied. So we really need to identify whether the menstrual cycle was something that impacted performance. And so that's kind of how this study really started, I suppose, was actually completing interviews with 17 elite female athletes. And that was from all different sports. So anything from judo to climbing, athletics, cycling, a whole host of sports, and completed semi-structured interviews with them individually, and really had two aims of those interviews. The first was to examine elite female athletes' experiences of their menstrual cycle, really focusing on that impact on training and competition performance. And then the second aspect of that was also around openness of conversation relating to the menstrual cycle with coaching and support staff. So like two aspects really, did it affect them, and do they actually talk about it if they do? So I really want to spend quite a lot of time today actually talking through some of those results with you, and also sharing how that's translated into practice now. So this is kind of like, I suppose I'd call this like a summary or an overview of what the results were. So athletes experiencing a natural cycle reported physical symptoms alongside kind of mood disturbances and reduced motivation to train. They were the two most common symptoms outside of the physical symptoms reported. Decision to actively control the menstrual cycle was often triggered by different factors. So whether it was reducing the impact on competition. Some sports I spoke to were sports that required making weight. So there was anxiety around fluctuations in weight and at competition, being able to manage that. And then also reducing the distraction during competition. So again, swimming, gymnastics, they were two that really, out of all of the athletes I suppose I spoke to, really kind of highlighted around that distraction and worry of leaking or blood showing through at competition. And athletes indicated an openness to talk about the menstrual cycle, but predominantly to other females. But there was a lot of variation in comfort of athletes' experience talking to male coaches. And that was these were elite athletes, all of them were Commonwealth Games or above, were the level they competed at. So actually in some instances, these were female athletes that had worked with their coaches for 8+ years, had gone to the Olympics and were reluctant to talk to their male coaches about their menstrual cycle. So I'll kind of go into a bit more detail in that, but that kind of gives you a summary of where we're going with the results. So there were four themes that were identified within the interviews, and I've highlighted those there, which were symptoms, impact on training and competition, coping, and I've put or not strategies, so actually in many instances not coping, and openness of conversation. And hopefully you can see there that I've kind of put on there the table I put together for the paper that was actually what sub-themes were included within those. So symptoms, physical, affective and psychological. And hopefully you can see table 4 there is reported physical symptoms. A whole range of physical symptoms were reported without even being prompted by female athletes. Some of them experienced one of those, some of them experienced the majority of those. It was a real range of symptoms that female athletes I spoke to reported. They also greatly changed with age. So very much reflecting on when they were younger, that actually their symptoms were much worse, and the use of contraceptives to manage symptoms, but also the flip side of that of contraceptives causing more symptoms or different symptoms to what they'd experienced. So for example, a common one was, I went on contraceptives to control my cycle, reduce stomach cramps, and in return had either like really bad headaches or changes in mood. Were really commonly reported. If we move on to impact on training and competition, it was really varied between the impact reported on training compared to competition. So in training, there was much more of an awareness and potentially alteration, whereas competition was much more around acceptance. Things like, I just have to get on with it, suck it up and deal with it, were definitely some reoccurring quotes that came out from there. It was definitely more at competition where medical intervention was reported. So whether that was contraceptives or some sort of pain relief to manage symptoms, and it being a distraction at competition was another final sub-theme that was commonly reported. As I said, around coping or not, actually in a lot of instances, it was very much around, I've put their mentality was just around getting on with it. I just have to deal with it, rather than actually proactively looking at options and strategies that can help manage the menstrual cycle. And support, that was again very much on the lacking side of things, in the fact that they potentially didn't seek support. Where they did, it was very much more from a medical perspective, rather than speaking to coaches and support staff. So that those conversations were really interesting for me in themselves. And then finally, openness of conversation. Gender of the coach was an influencing factor, as well as external factors. So age was one, experiences of other aspects relating to their menstrual cycle. So whether they're the age that they'd started using contraceptives or had had smear tests. So other factors where they'd start discussing the menstrual cycle was having an impact on whether they felt comfortable talking about it. Sometimes with the gender of the coach was really interesting, that actually some females said they'd talk to it at a competition, a female coach that they'd maybe never ever worked with, but would talk to them about their menstrual cycle rather than their coach that they worked day in, day out for 8-10 years. So there was definitely a variation, and hopefully if I flick onto some of these quotes now, it really hopefully adds some of the weight that the voice of the athlete that came out from having these conversations. So these were when talking to female athletes about their experiences of the menstrual cycle, comments that they said. The first days I was pretty grim. I just feel terrible. My periods were definitely worse when I was a teenager. Some specifically commented on factors that were affecting performance. So the impact of bloating on core performance was frequently reported, and how that made them feel less stable or not having such good tension to perform whichever exercise they were within training. Time before the period impacts training performance, but once I'm on, it's just the inconvenience of bleeding. I feel a bit lousy, but once it comes on, it's absolutely fine. I really do apologise. My dog is in the background making, Jazz, quiet, I was like, I'm going to have to tell her to be quiet because she's just getting louder and louder. I do apologise. The delights of working from home. So yeah, once it comes, it's absolutely fine. Just feel a bit lousy beforehand. You want to feel really confident and energetic when you get your period, but when you're on your period, you feel a bit rubbish. As I mentioned, there was that paranoia around leaking and that being a distraction, and comments around it being another thing to manage. But actually, in a lot of instances, it wasn't managed. It was just seen as something that had to be dealt with and just get on with it. And then I always love that final comment there around, I'd rather eat chocolate and watch TV on the sofa. So actually, from this, hopefully, I kind of went with the approach when I was doing the study with the athletes, that actually if everyone came back and said, my menstrual cycle doesn't affect me, it doesn't affect performance, it wasn't an area that we were going to continue researching. Potentially we'd look at other factors specific to female athletes that might have had an impact. However, as you can hopefully see from some of these direct quotes from the athletes, we very much find that the menstrual cycle was impacting them, whether that was in training and or competition. In some aspect, it was having an influence on them. Then if I move on to some of the quotes that came out of conversations, these were quite varied. So for example, one athlete, and it was within a couple, said, if it was affecting me, I felt like it was affecting my performance, I would openly talk about it. And that was referring to their coach. However, that was very much outweighed by quite a lot of alternative comments that were very much against not talking or comfortable. The word awkwardness came out so many times when I was speaking to them. So things like, I wouldn't say anything, I just don't want to because it's awkward. There's always an awkwardness, and when there's a male-dominated coach, that makes it more difficult because even the most understanding man, they don't really get it. So actually, it was really interesting to understand some of the perceptions that the female athletes also felt towards having conversations. If they're really awkward, then it makes you feel more awkward. There's definitely another influencing factor, as I said, around age. That was an external factor influencing comfort of conversation. So when I was younger, I would have been awkward, but not so much now. And then you had some at complete other end of the spectrum where I don't think I would ever have had that conversation. So really mixed within whether there was comfort talking about the menstrual cycle, but definitely a shift more towards not feeling comfortable, avoiding that conversation, and concern around awkwardness. And actually there was a lot linked to awkwardness and whether they'd had previous experiences of an awkward conversation, therefore just put them off wanting to have that conversation again. But an important aspect for me, although predominantly as a researcher, within the context of how I'm working, is actually translating that research into practice. And that's been a huge part of all of the research that I've been doing in this area. But specifically from this study, one of the key things that came out of it was to try and improve knowledge and understanding, to translate that into improved health, wellbeing and performance in elite female athletes. And predominantly that came through education. So whether that was of the athletes themselves, the coaches, and all the support staff and practitioners. And there's different aspects of that education that actually now, thinking about how we're translating that into practice, have started taking shape. So whether that's education through tracking and monitoring of menstrual cycles, so the athletes have more self-awareness and actually know what's going on to be able to share that with the coaches they're working with. Whether that's for the coaches to understand what that monitoring looks like, or for coaches and athletes to have kind of different education sessions. And that's something that I've been doing predominantly. Interestingly, a lot of sports want to start with coaches receiving education, so they feel they're able to have conversations then when athletes start understanding and having increased self-awareness of their menstrual cycle. And then support staff and practitioners, kind of working with them, but also to understand their comfort of conversations, their knowledge level, their awareness, and that's been really varied dependent on actually what area they're working in. So whether that's nutrition compared to strength and conditioning, compared to obviously more medical staff, that's been really varied, and how we approach that has been quite different. But fundamentally, it's been around actually being comfortable talking about the menstrual cycle. So for me, we could have gone into so many different aspects. How can you think about training? What do you need to consider? What are the different areas of sports science that could influence training and performance when we think about the menstrual cycle? But actually, if everyone wasn't comfortable having that conversation in the first place, that probably would have been pretty, like, I don't want to say useless, but would have been lost. It just wouldn't have had the same effect. So actually, a lot of the work of translating this into practice has really been actually how can we make athletes, coaches and support staff feel comfortable having conversations, so we can move on to that next step of looking into more detail around how it affects training and performance. And hopefully at some point I'll move back to looking at physiology rather than going down qualitative research, which is very much what I've been working on at the moment. And this has been the other aspect that's been really helpful in translating research into practice. So a big aspect of the interviews I completed was actually asking the elite athletes if there was information that they would find helpful in being able to manage their menstrual cycle and their experience. And I've kind of like grouped into key themes here as to what was requested. So first of all, contraceptives, including side effects. Long-term health impact was frequently asked. So actually the concern as to whether if they continue taking a form of contraception, was that having an impact on the health, but also on training and their performance. Menstrual products, what options are there, and are there any products which are preferential for sport? How the menstrual cycle can affect training and competition and different management strategies for that. Interestingly, they brought up that they'd like their coaches to receive more education to improve their awareness and understanding. So again, very much linked to that perception that maybe their coaches didn't have the knowledge or the understanding, which was making them reluctant to have conversations about the menstrual cycle. And then information for youth athletes. So I've kind of highlighted within there 2 areas I suppose we've really focused on our research moving forward. So actually how the menstrual cycle can affect training and competition and management. And that's been very much from an individual athlete perspective. So actually what symptoms or what experiences do individual single athletes have in relation to their menstrual cycle, and therefore what strategies could we put in place to ensure it doesn't have an impact. So whether that's distraction at competition, so think about menstrual products or how we can overcome that, all the way to severe cramps affecting competition, in training, the week before, just feeling lower on motivation. So it's been very much on an individual basis how we've supported that. And then coach education, that's been kind of a two-pronged approach really, of both creating coach education based on the themes that came out and the information requested by the elite athletes to improve their awareness, but also to assess it. So although I've started delivering coach education and limited by COVID, so it's very much been, especially, it started off more face-to-face, but it's definitely been more online. Actually also trying to assess, is that the best way to improve awareness, to change comfort of conversations, to increase that awareness and understanding, and trying to ensure it's over like a prolonged period of time. So rather than a one-off, here's some information about the menstrual cycle, actually how can we have interactions within that coach education to change behaviours, to change perceptions that have actually been, within the menstrual cycle. I think it's quite common to say that actually things like social media or adverts in the past have very much created the perception of the menstrual cycle being something we hide, something that's secret, something that could be embarrassing. And actually, how can we change those perceptions and behaviours has been a big aspect of that. So what next, I suppose, is quite a big area also to talk about in relation to that research, because it definitely put me in a place where I can almost use this picture, because I feel like at the moment I'm sat looking out over a landscape of what's going on within sport, within female athletes, and relating to the menstrual cycle, and actually where we need to go next, and how we can keep not only developing really good quality research, but also be able to use that within practice. And one of the things that I have been working on recently was actually completing a very similar study design, so semi-structured interviews with female coaches and practitioners, because one thing that did come up is actually, as a female coach or as a female practitioner, does that impact what support you provide to female athletes? So found out from doing the interviews with the athletes, actually they were preferred going to speak to a female coach or practitioner, but actually do their own experiences have an impact on what support they provide? So in some instances, if they don't experience any symptoms, does that reflect on what support they provide to the females they're coaching? But also, what impact does it have on them as female coaches or practitioners? So for example, at a high pressure, big competition like the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games, it's the week before their menstrual cycle. Do they experience changes in mood? Do they struggle with maybe not being as focused or lower motivation? Actually, how do they manage that within themselves? So that's been really interesting working on that project at the moment, alongside, as I said, very much around the coach education and how can we start changing and learning from those findings of the female athlete interviews that I completed, to actually be able to change what we're doing or how it looks like. So for example, with one female athlete, we've completely profiled the menstrual cycle, put in a multidisciplinary support team around her, and how does that fit within training, and discuss it as though we would all other aspects. So originally within that team supporting elite athletes, there were conversations about training, competition, how strength and conditioning fits into that. What about physiotherapy? How do we manage recovery? What about competition preparation? But actually the menstrual cycle wasn't anything that was ever considered or mentioned or discussed. And that's just one example how actually having that conversation, we've now worked on, first of all, the comfort of conversation. So that's definitely progressed and improved. So actually now everyone within the team is completely happy saying the words menstrual cycle. There's no longer euphemisms, or I'm sure no one will mind me sharing that they said they would just use the word the cycle when they refer to anything. And I was like, what part of the menstrual cycle are we talking about? The part where they're bleeding, or before, premenstrual? And it was just termed the cycle all of the time. So again, definitely have worked on that to then also help that athlete overcome those feelings of awkwardness, that we all now know that no one's awkward, no one's uncomfortable. And it's now meant that actually that next step's been able to be taken as actually, how is the menstrual cycle interacting? Has it had any impact? Even if it's just on feeling lower in motivation the week before. So how does that have an impact on training? So those conversations have really been able to open up as a result of that. Then another aspect that has come out with the coach education around the kind of what next, I suppose, and really listening to that athlete voice, is actually around male coaches and so rather than their own experiences, like I've kind of looked into with female coaches, with male coaches, what are their attitudes and beliefs? So actually, what do they know about the menstrual cycle? What beliefs has that created to actually know how we need to address that and work on that in elite sport environment? I've actually found in a lot of instances, male coaches and female coaches have a similar level of knowledge. It's actually just the perception of the athlete that maybe male coaches don't have as much knowledge because they don't experience it themselves. But actually, in many cases, they're equally happy, comfortable talking about the menstrual cycle. They're more afraid of making their female athlete feel awkward. So there's definitely this concern that everyone else is going to make each other feel awkward, and working on that and how we can kind of change those perceptions and move that forward. One of the key things that is within that is actually working with athletes when they're younger. So this study was very much in elite athletes already at the Commonwealth Games, already at Olympic level. But actually, what about, they were reporting they didn't have management strategies, different symptoms, they were just getting on with it was a distraction. But actually, what about those younger athletes, and reflecting on some of the quotes when they were talking about when I was younger, my symptoms were much worse, or I felt more awkward talking about it when I was younger. So actually more that development stage of athletes, how can we actually help those that level and those athletes? So actually when they get to elite level, we're not trying to think about how we can overcome comfort of conversation or helping elite athletes have that self-awareness of their menstrual cycle. We can do that at a much younger age. So actually when they get to that individual one-to-one bespoke sports science support that is quite common, that actually it's not around changing conversations, it's actually about performance. And we do some of that work a lot lower down when they're a lot younger. So actually I've wrapped up 5-10 minutes than I thought I was going to, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions and talk more around some of those results if that's of interest.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thanks so much for that, Natalie. I really enjoyed listening to that. And we have got a couple of questions already. So if you do have a question, remember just to pop it in the chat and I'll get them answered as well. Before I read out those couple that we've got sat there, I just wanted to ask a few things that I jotted down when we were chatting there. So I guess from everything that you've kind of mentioned there, what is the sort of one key thing that we could all maybe go away from today and kind of action, whether that's at that elite level or just working with recreational athletes, in terms of breaking down that sort of silence or that stigma that you feel sort of exists, not only in sport but in general life around the menstrual cycle?
One key thing I've been saying to quite a lot of coaches is trying to avoid using euphemisms and being confident saying the words menstrual cycle, and not being afraid to initiate a conversation about the menstrual cycle because you're worried about the response. Actually, a lot of females, when you start the conversation, are actually quite glad and almost a bit relieved that someone's asked them about their cycle, but they've just never known whether it's a subject they could bring up, or they're embarrassed to bring up, or concerned that the other person would be worried or anxious or awkward. So I've always just kind of said, actually initiate the conversation through potentially like an observation or evidence that you know or confident about the menstrual cycle. So example might be you've noticed a female athlete has come to you quite regularly, pretty much at a similar time every match, but just says they don't feel very well. Actually spring that conversation up by saying, I've noticed you feel unwell, repeating over a few months. Is that linked with your menstrual cycle? Are you aware it's linked with your menstrual cycle? And straight away, you've given evidence, you've got a clear message of what you want to say, and you've also made it okay to talk about.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And also what I thought was interesting was what you mentioned about the female coaches and how they might have those almost sort of determined what they perceive of the menstrual cycle based on how they experience it. And I thought it was quite interesting what you said there about that, because I know just sort of talking to like anyone sort of in this area, or like even my friends, I know some of them don't experience it anywhere like what I do, in terms of I normally get really bad period pains, bad cramps, or in the past have, whereas them sort of had a breezy cycle, and they wouldn't have, if they were sort of coaching me, they might have had that predetermined thing of, oh, maybe he's just being a bit of a wimp and not kind of getting on with it, which I thought was really interesting what you said there about that as well. And then also one thing that I noticed in the paper as well was about that fear of leaking, so whilst on the period, and how that might be taking up a lot of their thoughts when it comes to performing and training. So what would you kind of recommend for coaches and any kind of one that's supporting that athlete in terms of making that sort of easier or relieving any of those sort of anxiety around that?
I think one of the, again, I don't want to sound like I'm repeating myself, but provide the opportunity to talk about it. So actually a lot of them had just kept it to themselves, and so therefore it was just a huge anxiety for themselves. One of the athletes I spoke to, though, she'd kind of used other female athletes within her group, and there was almost a consensus that they all looked out for each other. So if anyone they noticed was leaking or bleeding, they just kind of say to each other, you might want to go to the toilet. And it was that kind of, again, they've created that environment, and the coach had led on that, of creating the environment where they felt supported by others within that training group. So it wasn't something that was all of a sudden anxious. They knew that there were other people looking out for them and also providing that support for them. And that was kind of also another example of that, was like a peer buddy system, where actually they'd talked to an older athlete, so younger athletes talking to older athletes to have conversations about how they manage their periods, what do they use, what menstrual products do they use. So especially at that younger age, a lot reflected back that they just knew what their parents or what their mum had given them to use, but with regards to a menstrual product. So there was that reflection that actually from elite athletes, they would have liked to have known more about that, which is where the menstrual products came out of. And actually talking to some of the female coaches, that was one aspect that they'd put in place with their group of younger females, is paired younger and older athletes together. So it gave them the opportunity to go and speak to an older athlete to say, well, how do you manage it and what do you use? And that was kind of one example that came out from those conversations with female coaches. But like you picked up on, it was so varied that some coaches did actually comment on, it's just an excuse. They use it to get out of training. They should just get on with it. They're being weak was actually commented. Whereas definitely there was a complete utter end of the spectrum with other female coaches that clearly experienced quite severe symptoms themselves and therefore adapted training, or where actually they were more proactive in bringing up the conversation to ask females they coached how it affected them and if it did affect training and performance at all.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And I liked what you said about that sort of buddy system in terms of everyone sort of, or having someone to sort of talk you through when you're that younger athlete. I know I would have sort of benefited from something like that as well. And also what you mentioned about period products, I guess sort of coaches and all of that could make sure that in whatever sort of first aid kits, or just they're readily available in toilets or whatever. So it's not something that, you know, it could be unpredictable. We all don't know every month when it might arrive, especially when we're younger. So yeah, no, I think that's useful as well, what you said there. And then talking about sort of teen athletes and those younger experiences, something that you reported in the paper was what were symptoms when they were younger, and also coupled with that, this reduced awareness and lower confidence. So how do you suggest we sort of get this information to those that kind of a peer that they need it the most, especially at that younger level?
Yeah, it's definitely quite, I suppose that's really led to where some of the research is that I've done more within what education's like in schools. So one of the things, I suppose, I was having quite a few conversations with other people all kind of working in a similar area, that it's been a very much a reactive approach. So when they're at elite level, we're very much reacting to trying to change their awareness or dealing with whatever they've just managed. And actually one of the starting points for that was, well, actually what information have females previously received? So I kind of went away, started looking at what education is provided in schools, to find out that hadn't actually ever been looked into. So that's actually what we went on to look into, was to identify what education is provided, because for us that almost seemed like a really good starting point, whether that was for those that were going to stay on the pathway of becoming like developmental and elite athletes, or even if it was just to help keep more females active and involved within sport. Actually, how did having that information really affect that? I had quite, within doing a lot of this work and working with coaches, more and more coaches coming back to me saying, how do we stop the menstrual cycle being a factor causing a dropout from sport? So we've got a really good young female athlete, but she drops out because she doesn't know how to manage a period, or misses a week every month or like every cycle from training, and just slips further and further behind everyone else in the group, so gives up. And that's actually a really common question that we had come up, which resulted in trying to look at this, what education is provided, first of all in schools, to then almost know what to build on within like the pathways. But it's actually also been something else I've been working on with UK Pathways, to put together like resources for the development athletes. And we've actually put together a video for coaches to be able to share and watch. So hopefully that's more accessible for a lot of the younger athletes, that they can see that, and also getting that message out wider to coaches to start the conversation, help your female athletes to learn about their menstrual cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And you presented some of that at the Women in Sport conference, so definitely I enjoyed listening to all of that education as well. We have a couple of direct questions here. So Natalie mentioned that regular training and education on the menstrual cycle rather than a one-off sort of education is better. So how would you recommend educating athletes and coaches throughout a season, for example?
Yeah, so I've kind of been doing like smaller, shorter, but kind of more consistent, kind of like at the moment, as I said, it's very much been online, so it's been more kind of like workshop online approaches. So for example, one team I'm working with, they've got basically like group camps every month for 4 months. So actually every month we're doing like an additional session and building on what we've done previously. And that's a combination of athletes on their own, athletes and coaches together, and coaches on their own. So we're kind of educating both of them, but also bringing everything together. So that's very much in a structured team environment. But I've been trying to, in different sports, it's just been delivering a series of kind of workshops where you reflect back on what we've done in the previous workshop and keep building on that and keep adding information. with always opportunity to share, have they put it into practice? What barriers have there been putting that information into practice, and then being able to address that within the session. And it's also really created almost more of like a conversation, a community, when coaches then have been discussing it more with each other, and going away and talking to coaches that they work with, which is then again influencing more people's practice.
Yeah, and then in terms of that delivery, like what you mentioned there, in terms of athletes and then coaches and then them together, what, in your sort of personal opinion, do you think works best? So is it better having all the athletes and then all the coaches sort of educated separately, or is it fine just to have them both together?
It's, in my experience, it's been really mixed. So in some situations, it's been very much led that coaches actually felt that they'd be more comfortable having information first before anything had been delivered to their athletes. So in that instance, we kind of delivered information to the coaches first. Whereas in other situations, it's been kind of everyone together to start off with, and then opportunity for coaches and athlete sessions separately, if to then go into more information that's specific to them. So actually, like how do you consider the menstrual cycle as a coach compared to how do you manage that as an athlete? So it's been really different, but that's been one of the key things for me of how I've been delivering it, is actually what's right for the sport and the environment and the structure they've got set up as to how that information is being and that education is being delivered.
Yeah, no, I think, and like what you mentioned there in terms of maybe it's like if you're an athlete and it all comes down to like selection or getting picked, it might not be something that you want to sort of have with your coach there if you feel like there's a judgment there and all of that as well. But I think that's all of the questions that we've got coming in. I don't believe there's any more. So thank you so much, Natalie. That was great. And thank you for allowing us to ask lots of questions there at the end. And also a big thank you for everyone logging on and joining us live on Facebook as well. Hope you all enjoyed it. So this session has been recorded and will be available to view in the next couple of days for anyone that missed it or anyone who'd like to watch it again. The next meeting we have is on Monday the 10th at 6:30 again, and this time we're joined by Dan Martin. So he is a lecturer in sports physiology with a specialist interest in female athletes. So in 2018, he completed his PhD, which was titled The Effect of Reproductive Hormones and Energy Availability on Muscle Function, Cognition, and Bone Metabolism in Females. And he's going to be presenting some of his latest data looking at injury incidence across the menstrual cycle in international footballers. We might also be joined by a couple more exciting researchers in the area as well. So hopefully this is all going to be confirmed. So watch out for any further updates on that. But that's all from me. And thank you again to Natalie, but hopefully we'll see you all again next time. Thank you. I'll just let everyone drop off there, Natalie, and then
Yeah, no problem.
Also remember to stop recording so my video is not really long.